This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Every year, a cohort of emerging artists and curators gather at NXTHVN, a fellowship program empowering and connecting creators and the New Haven community. There are galleries, studios, and event space inside two former manufacturing plants, right in the center of New Haven's Dixwell neighborhood. This hour, we'll be discussing this program and the needs it aims to meet for the many artists and creatives around where we live. NXTHVN was co-founded by private equity investor Jason Price and visual artist Titus Kafar, whose art can be found in museum collections across Connecticut and the country. Here's Kafar in conversation with Kalida Brown-Dean, host of Connecticut Public show Disrupted back in 2022.
NXTHVN is a collage of art and business. From the arts perspective, we are a new national arts model dedicated to advancing the careers of young artists of color through access and education. I went to a really good art school, enjoyed myself there, even though it was incredibly frustrating at times. Feel like I moved on to a path of quote unquote success, but realized that my time in graduate school taught me nothing about the business of art. And the sort of problem with that is everyone in the art world knows the business of art except for the artist, which means that the artist ends up getting taken advantage of. So we put a program together that we felt like could create the vocabulary, the language to speak with artists about that thing that we don't like to talk about so much, which is the money of it all.
Current curatorial fellows are exploring the idea of the multi-local in a current exhibit. And here they are to discuss. With me is Clare Patrick. Clare, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hi, thank you for having us. This is really exciting.
No, we're excited to have you on too. And also Marquita Flowers. Marquita, thanks for being on Where We Live today.
Thank you. Good morning.
And Clare and Marquita are both current curatorial fellows at NXTHVN. Their exhibit, To Echo a Shadow, will be on view at NXTHVN through Sunday. And for our listeners, when and where do you create in community? Let us know. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Marquita, I want to start with you. Can you walk us through how you developed the exhibit To Echo a Shadow, and also talk about the idea of the multi-local?
Sure. This was very much a collaborative effort of Clare and I. As you start NXTHVN, you're really introduced to a really dynamic and amazing group of artists and, curators. And Clare and I just happened to have a really lot of intersection in terms of the type of artwork that we were really excited about, which surrounded the, performance, time-based work such as video, sound, and installation. And so we started off just like mapping out and naming some of the artists that we were interested in, and then went from there. And then it eventually sort of emerged to see that there were common themes amongst sort of how these artists were making work and their practice. And that really sort of guided us to thinking through bigger themes and bigger words that we've used in the exhibition to describe it, which are around like migration, and like you were bringing up multi-local, which for us was really a way to think about how as people traverse across the globe for various reasons, whether you were forced through migration or there's a personal choice, sort of you are bringing a set of knowledges with you that sort of represent home and where sort of the journey, and then also where you sort of end up and land. And so for us, the multi-local was a really sort of poetic and beautiful way to encapsulate all of that knowledge that exists and that happens through the sort of experience of migration.
And Clare, the exhibit is called To Echo a Shadow. Can you talk about how did that come up?
Sure. So, yeah, we really love the title. I think it took some getting into. I think we had, again, quite a collaborative process throughout the thinking through this exhibition. And we were sort of throwing words around, doing sort of brainstorming, mind maps, wordplay. And I think the title came together sort of almost by chance, but really encapsulated a lot of the ideas of the show, which is this sense of a presence. So in order for there to be a shadow, there needs to be some sort of light source and some sort of object that casts a shadow. And equally, the echo is a sort of sonic representation of a shadow in some sense as well, where there has to be a sound of some kind and a space for there to be an echo within. So it's quite a poetic title that we kind of came upon. We came up with together, and it really sort of speaks to this idea of the kind of installation work within the exhibition, but also the kind of resonances that we're hoping kind of translate throughout the show.
And with that resonance too, I think this sense of presence and space is a big theme, I feel like, here. So can you also talk about, Clare, how did the Dixwell neighborhood fold into that research? We know there's a listening space in the lobby at Next Haven that touches on this, right?
Yes, exactly. So we were very excited about the kind of musical history of the Dixwell area. When we first got to Next Haven in August last year, we were taken on a wonderful sort of walking tour by the Greater New Haven African American Historical Society. And this was really a wonderful kind of sense of getting to know where we were situated within the Dixwell neighborhood, as Next Haven is sort of a new part of the neighborhood, but getting situated within a kind of local sense of the space. And we walked past the Monterey Club, or the building which used to hold the Monterey Club. And we were really, obviously not being from New Haven, excited about the ways that music can be carried with us and the ways that music can be held onto and passed along and shared. So the listening space is really kind of in reference to this idea of the Monterey Club and various jazz venues that populated Dixwell throughout history, but that was a very important sort of stopping over point as musicians toured throughout sort of the East Coast routes. So the listening space in our exhibition is situated right at the start of the show in the Next Haven lobby as you enter the building. And it's a space where we have curated a selection of jazz records from artists who performed in the area. And it's a kind of space to gather and listen and share. There's a record player with 4 different sets of headphones that are all sort of linked up together. So it's really a space to kind of begin the exhibition through this moment of gathering and listening.
And here I want to share another bite from Titus Kafar, who was on Disrupted in 2022, talking about the importance of community. And he also touched a bit about the local history that you were describing, Clare. Here's Kafar again.
At our openings, you'll see the director of MoMA, but that's not nearly as exciting to me as the group of kids who just kind of hang out at our gallery space and know us and feel like this is their space. This is a part of their community, and they feel comfortable in it. And everybody on our team knows that they are to be made to feel welcome. That's a non-negotiable for us. So we also recognize that the other thing that's great about that community is there is a legacy there. There's a history there. It's really easy to think about that period in which there was no investment in that neighborhood, but there was a before that. And before that, that was a neighborhood of rich culture. That was a neighborhood full of music. And one thing that folks sometimes know is that the Monterey Club, that jazz club, famous jazz club in New Haven, was right down the street from us. So we feel like although this is innovative and new, it's been built on the foundation that our ancestors left for us. We are doing everything that we can do to make sure that that neighborhood is not gentrified in a way that would push out the people that we came there for. I lived in that neighborhood first. That's the reason why we're there.
Marquita, I would love to get a response from you from what Kafar said. I mean, he touched on a lot, the space being welcoming and the history with the neighborhood. Anything that jumped out to you that you would like to respond to?
Yeah, a few things. I think Claire and I were really interested in activating the lobby, and Next Haven has this beautiful sort of floor to ceiling windows, and we were like, how do we make this space? How do we sort of encourage folks to come in and like really engage with the space? And so the listening sort of area was really set and curated with the intention to be welcoming and to sort of like, get people interested in or maybe sort of breaking down some of the boundaries or perceptions that people might have about types of spaces and where they can go. And so that was a really big intention for us in thinking through how do we introduce people to the exhibition. But then overall, I think Titus is really hitting on a lot of points about sort of the potential for engagement with art around all types of people, but particularly in a really local sense about like what it means to create a space where people feel safe, where they can explore new ideas, where they can be, maybe see something they haven't seen before, but then tied in within that feel really familiar with everything that's around because the people that look like them are in that space. And so when I was deciding on whether or not I should attend Next Haven, that was one of the big draws to the program was its location and sort of its really ethos and ethics behind its mission. And yeah, it's been a wonderful time to be there and sort of experience all the sort of like magic and beauty that the Next Haven was founded on
Well,
and really want to tap into.
right.
Mhm.
And I love that idea that, I mean, the way Titus built the image of kids being in the gallery and just hanging out, like, I think that's a very beautiful and magical space to be in. I think if kids want to be there, I think the highest compliment I think any space can have,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah, definitely.
and you're talking about outreach and making sure that the space is welcoming for everyone. Our producer, Katie Pellico, was able to attend one event that you all held for the public, which is called Sounds of New Haven. Can you tell us about this event, Marquita, and why is that outreach so important?
Yeah, I mean, Claire touched on it earlier that we were new to New Haven, right? Like sort of one of the um, ask of Next Haven in the program is for people to move there and to sort of relocate. And while Claire and I clearly took on that task, and everyone has, we also recognized how new we were to the community and really wanted to sort of engage with folks who had been there, who lived there, and who have sort of their daily experiences of this place. And so for the workshop, we invited folks to come into the space and sort of make a painting or a drawing or any sort of like mark making activity that really mimicked sounds that they heard in their homes or like sort of everyday commute through life. And so we did that with a little bit of very simple tech, which is like through a contact microphone. And so these microphones are not so much made to pick up audio and people speaking, but they're really they create sort of a haptic feedback through touch. And so as people entered the workshop, we sort of introduced them to how the sonic and market making sort of played hand in hand, and then really asked them to think about a sound that they hear in their daily life. For me, that was the whisking of eggs or like making breakfast with my 2-year-old. And it was very much this like sort of scraping sound that I kept thinking about. And so through using like a metal like palette knife, which was traditionally used to like mix paint together, we were sort of scraping that against the paper. And through the contact mic and connection to like a PA system, essentially we were able to pick up the sounds that this mark making made. And so it was quite experimental for us. We are not heavy audio people and experience in that realm, but we were really interested in sort of bridging this gap between like mark making and sound, but then also really encouraging people to think about, yeah, just like something that folks might take for granted, which is just like the noise that exists in our everyday life. And we're really trying to think about how you can create sort of a sense of a neighborhood or a sense of home through those sounds.
Well, as you were describing, I'm hearing beans grinding in my head, which I think can be a little
Mhm.
jarring if that was like exploded on the sound system. I feel Like,
Yeah, but like that was the fun part in terms of like thinking, yeah, like, my partner makes smoothies all the time in the morning,
mm,
and that like sound of a blender is very much something that we hear every morning. And so yeah, I think Claire and I were really excited about the potential of those sounds coming together. We worked with Justin Treat, who is a former Next Haven apprentice who like went through the high school apprenticeship program and is now a staff member at Next Haven. He has this beautiful recording studio on the lower level of the building. And he really helped us sort of capture all the sound that was being recorded, that was being made that day, but then also edited these sounds to become a sort of really beautiful sort of like score or like track essentially. And so it was a really also like lovely moment to collaborate with other sort of folks at Next Haven who have different sorts of knowledge and interests, but that all sort of like intersect through sound.
well, of course,
Yeah.
we can't talk about sound without actually introducing some of that soundtrack of New Haven. So let's take a moment and listen to some of the visitors.
I'm imagining my morning routine with just getting out of bed. I'm like throwing the covers off. These are some footsteps as I walk over to the bathroom.
Now I'm going to take this little scraper and I'm going to try and mimic opening my phone, which is typically the first thing I do. Actually, by typically, I mean it is never not the first thing I do in the morning.
But I do like pancakes. Like mom makes pancakes, she like flips the pancakes. It sort of, kind of sounds like that.
What kind of sounds were you creating?
Like drum sounds. With the paintbrush. A lot of drum sounds because I just finished listening to Afro house music before I got here. So basically, I was brushing, but I wasn't really hearing nothing. Maybe just a small shh, shh. I was like, I want to make some noise, so it just started, doing what you're not supposed to do with a brush, and just jamming on the paper, boom, 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 boom. Then I started jamming with my fingers at the same time. With one hand I had the paper, and one hand I had the brush, and one hand was on the top of the table, banging with the fingers. So I was actually making like my own little two-man orchestra with maybe like 10 fingers.
So you were listening to Hackett Landefeld, Anna Levine, and grade schooler Isabel, as well as Alan Jackson, aka DJ Dulio. So Claire, I want to ask you, we were talking earlier about sound being a huge part of this project. So can you talk about how this sound will be used in the exhibit, Claire?
Yeah, and thank you so much. It's so interesting to listen back. I think on the day we were
Right.
very impressed in running the workshop. So it's great to hear how people were responding to the kind of prompts that we put forward. So yes, our idea is very much for this exhibition to kind of live on in different capacities, and sound being something that can be transported and shared and sort of digitized is something we're really trying to make the most of. So the workshop was recorded via these contact microphones that Marquita mentioned. So we have this sort of percussive score, which Justin is helping us work through. And we are in the process of kind of figuring out what the next steps are, to be honest. We're very excited about the potentials of this project developing into a sort of record or sort of album that we can then later share. But the idea is very much to sort of, again, tie into these ideas of multi-local knowledge and the importance of sound, which can be carried and shared. So yeah, the sort of next steps process is going to be working with the recording that we did from the Sounds of New Haven event, and then also hopefully inviting in additional contributors to work with this sound specifically and respond to it.
And
Yeah.
go for it.
Just like making sort of, yeah, like Claire was saying, uses this percussive score, and then yeah, inviting artists who we have already been engaging with, but also hopefully new folks to then like make a song in response to it. We were kind of really interested in thinking through like, yeah, what it meant to make an album based off of something that was so abstract, but that was also, made by a lot of people. And so the different scales of engagement between the public and artists is something that we're also really interested to like continue to play with and develop. So yeah, just wanted to put that in there.
Well, and that's perfect because talking about the development with new artists and still connecting with familiar artists is at the event, Alan Jackson, or also known as DJ Dulio, who lives in the neighborhood, and he was there with his two daughters, and he'll sometimes DJ events for Next Haven, and he took a moment to talk about the still budding relationship with the local community.
It's something to do. It's great for the community. And surprisingly, when I ask people in the community who live like maybe 4 doors down, they've never walked in the building. So that's an issue. And it's something like that could be maybe intimidating, meaning that I remember being in that place when I walked to Aces on Orange Street as a young kid going to high school, wondering where all these other kids are going to what art school. I don't know what this is. And when I get there, it just was like kind of like no one's talking to me. What do I do? So I just left the building, came home, and then the streets became my gallery. The city of New Haven became my art gallery. So now maybe I could have just put a little more energy into saying, hello, I'm here. Somebody talk to me. Change my life for me, please. And that's what I think that these people around here need to have that person outreach, walk around the community, be like, hey, there's an artist school right here. It's just huge.
All right, Marquita, come here and change my life for me here. What are your thoughts with what he had to say?
Yeah, I think Dulio's he's hitting on points that are so real for all types of people in terms of thinking through access, thinking about like what it means to feel like you have agency over like your community and people that are in your community, or that you can be a contributor to what people are doing as well. And so I think he is, touching on something that I personally have not necessarily struggled with, but it's such a forefront in terms of thinking about what it means to curate art exhibitions, who comes into these spaces, who is being the most impacted by this work. And I think it is something that, like Claire and I were really intentional about not necessarily wanting to put on an exhibition that felt like we were representing a neighborhood or like this, sort of really dynamic, rich history of Dixwell, but we're really just trying to like tap into one aspect of it, which was through the music history, and sort of let that be an entry point or a guiding point for folks to come into the space and experience the more sort of like experimental and abstract sort of like exhibition that To Echo a Shadow is. But overall, I think like it's a sort of problem that I see in neighborhoods everywhere. I grew up in the Bronx and went to an art high school in Queens, and so much of my experience was guided by my own interests, but also really supported by my mother. And so I grew up sort of, walking into like a major museum like MoMA, feeling also really intimidated, but then through sort of experiencing and seeing artworks that maybe a painting was also like of a young Black person, or just like seeing work that felt like it was reflective of some experience I had, definitely sort of helped me break through the boundaries of feeling like I didn't have access to these spaces. And so I think while it's very much the work of Next Haven and sort of any organization that wants to do community work to be really intentional about their outreach and be really specific, and maintaining engagement over the course of, their sort of life cycle in that neighborhood. I also think it's on the emphasis of people to really be more vocal about what they want to see. It's like if I lived across the street from Next Haven, I would be like, hi, how are you? My name is Marquita. Can I do this in this space? And so I think there is that openness on Next Haven's end, but I also think it's relationships are reciprocal. And I think about organizations also being in that same sort of reciprocal space, right? Like you have you were doing things that you want a particular people and neighborhood to see and feel and experience. And so like as you give out, as you sort of invest and like do all this programming, I think the more that people respond to that will just, it'll blossom and grow into something that is really impactful for generations. And that's so much of what I hope to see from Next Haven and Dixwell and their, continued relationship.
Well, I think you basically answered my final question for you, Marquita, in that beautiful answer. Thank you so much. And Claire, we got to go to break soon, but I do want to ask something very similar with what Marquita just showed. As you're both wrapping up this year-long fellowship, can you tell us, how are you feeling, or maybe some takeaways from your time that you hope that you can share with our listeners? Got about a minute here.
Wow, a minute for a really big.
I know.
That's no, it has. It's been such a special experience. I think the emphasis on collaboration has been something that was initially a real draw to the program for me, but just to actually experience it, that being collaboration between Marquita and myself, which has been absolutely incredible and so beautiful. But also between the studio fellows, also in residence, and then these opportunities to engage and create interaction with the broader community of Dixwell and New Haven more broadly. I think we are very excited to look forward to our culminating event, which I'm just going to quickly plug, which is this Saturday, May 18th. And it will run sort of afternoon to evening. And that's a sort of final moment of collaboration, sharing, celebration, where we will be once again activating the beauty and the importance of sound as a way to kind of connect and engage with each other. And yeah, I think for me, coming from South Africa, from Cape Town, just to have the opportunity to engage in a kind of international community, engage with the artists that have been around the program and the various other sort of points of connection that have been possible, that's something that's been really special. And I'm going to definitely hold on to that for a very long time.
Well, it was a short minute, but you did it beautifully. You were listening to Clare Patrick and Marquita Flowers, who are both current curatorial fellows at Next Haven. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And there's more information about their exhibit on our website at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. And you're listening to some of the sounds of New Haven that were recorded at Next Haven, thanks to their producer, Justin Treat. And coming up, we hear from a former Next Haven fellow who is fostering her own artistic community in Connecticut, artists and creatives. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're exploring the different ways artists and creatives create community, including Next Haven, a self-described new national arts model in New Haven. Joining me now is one of their former curatorial fellows, Michelle Phuong Ho. Michelle is a New Haven-based poet and curator who recently founded a literary salon called Quietly Wild. Michelle, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And listeners, let us know, how do you create in community? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Michelle, you've been listening along so far this hour. Can you talk about anything that jumped out to you from our conversation with Marquita and Clare, who are two current curatorial fellows at Next Haven?
Yeah, I actually really loved what Marquita said about what it means to carry home with you as part of how they imagine their exhibition. It's one of the reasons why I moved back to New Haven, and also how I understand myself in relation to this place.
And talking about understanding yourself in relations to the space, how would you characterize the arts community or communities in New Haven?
Yeah, I mean, so much of what I've experienced here is sort of this mix of being like a somebody and then also being like a nobody. And actually, something else that was in the first segment, what Titus said about when you go into these like openings and receptions in these art spaces, often like you think it's actually the important people to pay attention to, but what's exciting is actually just like your neighbor coming in and being like, oh my gosh, you're here, you're at this party. And so for me, when I started coming back to New Haven and realizing like the way that I would feel in these different spaces, I remember feeling like, oh, like I'm like a nobody, like I don't have like a resume. I don't have, like a book. I don't have an exhibition history to my name. And so realizing that in those spaces, people don't pay attention to you. That's what, DJ Dulio also mentioned, right? Like what it means to come into these spaces and no one's talking to you. And there's sort of like a lack of dignity there that then kind of motivated my own practice in terms of poetry, but also in curating like spaces for artists to gather.
Well, and of course, I definitely want to get into your poetry in a second, but because we've been talking about Next Haven and what a unique space that is for artists. And can you talk about, what needs did Next Haven meet for you? Especially, you're talking about you didn't have the resume, you didn't have that dignity. Was Next Haven a place to do that for you?
I would say yes and no, and I'll share why. So on the one hand, actually, when I moved to New Haven, I didn't actually have a job or like I didn't come here for school. I was an undergrad here like a decade ago, but I actually moved back because I wanted to essentially actively displace myself from like a way of life that I had been living in the Bay Area that was like built on this pattern of moving to places or migration, so to speak, in relation to place that was basically trying to like make something of myself, right? Kind of like this movement up and to the right that is so like prevalent in how we move these days for opportunity, for education, for a job. And I actually moved back to New Haven because I had friends here. I still had friends here who had invested in the city. And even the home that I lived in, or that I currently live in, my friends were the landlords, right? And so when I got the call from Next Haven, because I applied basically when I moved here, I remember driving by Titus's old studio in Beaver Hills, where I actually met at a decade ago when I was an undergrad, when I met him. And that was actually the first artist community that I was sort of part of, because he hosted this like artist circle, and we shared a faith community at that time. And when I got that call, it almost like felt like a poem in some ways, because it was like a return to this place. I was like driving by Titus's studio. I get the call from Titus and then ED Nico. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I got in, right? And so that was this feeling of acceptance of, oh my gosh, like this is my open door to reconnect to artistic community in a way that I really didn't have before that. But at the same time, I also observed, we would host these receptions. And even though like I had the label as curatorial fellow, I also felt that I was sort of like an imposter, in part because I feel like I didn't have sort of the chops to rub shoulders with the who's who in the art world. Like that's just not how I'm wired, right? And so in some ways you feel the status of being part and accepted into a place, and at the same time, like still like who you are in the eyes of kind of the culture, which is like, oh, you're actually nobody. You're not important, So it's a little bit of both.
And I mean, that's so many layers of experiences that you have to, I think, unpack while doing the curation and the art. And we've been talking a lot about sound, but you have a focus on poetry, which we can also talk about includes sound. But can you talk about how this was a natural step for you, and also the similarities you see with poetry and curation?
Yeah, I love that, because actually one of the gifts of Next Haven for me was less so kind of having this title of like, oh, suddenly I'm a curator now, because I hadn't had any experience with that. But actually it was the conversations that I had with other artists and this third space that was created. But when you put sort of like this bunch of people in a room and, you kind of become a certain kind of community, right?
Right.
And for me, I wanted to create rooms where folks who might not belong together would be able to have different kinds of conversations by focusing on like what is worth paying attention to, right? And so I knew I wanted to write when I moved back to New Haven, and it was sort of the space that afforded the time to do that. And I'm not sure if you know this, but actually, like in poetry, a stanza, which is sort of the building block of a poem, is actually it means room in Italian, I believe. And so, yeah, and so one of the things like I was really interested in when I pivoted and sort of focused more on my own writing was like, oh, what could I put in this room on paper, just as I might like put in a room in conversation of artists within or artist works in an exhibition space, and what kind of conversations could be had that emerge from putting those works in conversation with each other, or elements of a poem in conversation with each other.
Well, that just made me realize I'm never going to see a piece of paper the same way again. So. Turning a page actually means opening a door to a different room, right? Exactly. And I mean, that's blowing my mind. It will continue to be blown for a while. And because we're talking about curation, but like you said, it's kind of like a label. There's so many things you can do with it. And I know in previous conversations, you've also talked about considering public programming and education when it comes to your work. But you eventually linked those ideas back to curation. Can you talk about this idea that a curator can also be an educator as well?
Well, I think the word to curate actually means to care. I think that's like the root of it. And it's to care for works of art, but also to care and shape culture, right? And so like, I would say, yeah, I guess I could consider myself an educator in the sense that I want to like teach people how to see. And that's what curators do. You basically select works, put them in a room, and in doing that, inviting people into that party, into that house, into that room, you're basically saying like, this is worth paying attention to. And so for me, like what feels important in the work of curating, educating, art making, writing is like inviting people to pay attention to what's worth seeing and dignifying, and saying like, oh, actually, like this is a way of caring for those works of art, whether that's a literal painting or a person. And then in that way is like shaping the culture of like, usually when we pay attention to what is in a room, we always like gravitate toward like maybe what's important, or like we fix our eyes on like the person with the mic, the person with, you know, a title or status, or like, you know, the MoMA, you know, ED or something like that, right? But actually, like, what if like part of that act of say educating folks on what to see, it means actually saying like, hey, this nobody or this thing that is often overlooked, that's worth seeing. And so that's how I approach like my poetics, but also in curating or gathering like spaces for artists, or sort of like spaces for folks to learn how to like read a poem, right? So that's sort of how I approach that.
Well, and even something like giving a definition to a label, like saying to curate is to care and to care about art. With that in mind, does that change the way you view that room, you know, or the piece of paper? Or have you heard from people that you've been in that room with how they're experiencing the room that you created?
Yeah, I mean, with Quietly Wild, which is sort of this like new space that I just randomly, I honestly started like gathering as of last month. Part of the desire was like, oh, like I happened to come across a text that I really love. It's called Chronicles of a Village. It's actually about like this author who, speaking of the multi-local, is speaking to all of these memories and emotions associated with a place that actually isn't really named. The village isn't named in the text, but through his like writing actually evokes like that sense of place, even in his own displacement from it due to war, conflict in this village that he speaks of, right? And so I read this in Southeast Asia on a visit there like a couple years ago, and then I was like, I would love to have people like gather in a room in order to like read this text in a focused and like quiet way. And part of the desire was like, you know, so often we spend like 2 seconds looking at a work of art, or like people don't really read anymore. They kind of just like skim. And I think that's how we're socialized these days, right? And so what if like we could gather around what I felt like was a wild text, something that was like unruly, something that was kind of like breaking the rules of what poetry or a novel could be, and asking folks like, let's get quiet enough, let's like dial down the noise in our lives in order to let the text like read us, let the text like highlight what's going on within us and what might emerge from that, right? And so like in creating that space, folks were able to really listen to like their inner voices as well as what resonated in the text. And it sort of brought us back down to basics in terms of like, wait, this is why we read. This is why we look at art, because it actually speaks to us. And it's not actually something to analyze apart from our lives or communities, but it actually can allow something to emerge. And so one of the people who attended that event, the thing she took away was like, oh, my strange cry, which is a phrase in the text, has a part in this story, in the history that we're currently in. That actually her lament about like what's going on in the world right now, like has a place in the story. And so that was just a beautiful moment of like art speaking to life, speaking to history.
Well, I just want to say that this is the start of the week, but after what you just described, I'm feeling so calm right now, Michelle. Well, you've been listening to Michelle Phuong Ho, who's a poet and curator, and she'll be staying with us. And we'll continue this conversation and hopefully dialing the quiet after a quick break. Let us know where you create in community. Call us at 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We're back with Michelle Phuong Ho, who's a New Haven-based poet and curator and recently launched her own literary salon called Quietly Wild. So Michelle, earlier we've been talking a lot about spaces, whether it's on paper or like a physical room in a gallery. You know, can you talk about how have you set out to create community since your NXTHVN fellowship? And also tell us more about Quietly Wild.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, community is literally like, who do I feel drawn to? Who's, you know, someone I feel like I want to talk to in a room. And so in some ways it's not so contrived, I guess.
Sure.
But for me, like a lot of the folks that I've gathered with lately, I literally will like go to an event. So I just went to this celebration of a book called The Best We Could Do by T. Bui at the public library in Stetson Public Library. Actually, that's in Dixwell. And I ran into these two women and I was like, oh my gosh, we should be friends. And they actually came to Quietly Wild, our first gathering. And so that experience of like going to events, these third spaces, seeing who's highlighted and being like, hey, we should talk. That's sort of how I've like built community in New Haven. And also like having folks who have already been here for some time. And in gathering with folks, I have, you know, hosted a cohort of writers who were in the community, but really didn't have kind of the resources to level up in their craft. And I realized like, oh, I could actually gather folks in this like writer's circle to exchange work and let the writing not just like be something to improve, but actually speak to what's going on in folks' lives. So everything from dealing with like rejection to like, you know, how do we revise something in order to share it? And then with Quietly Wild, like I said earlier, it was honestly just like an impulse to gather certain people in a room and have an occasion for it. And realizing, oh, if I put these folks together in a room, I wonder what would come up when we read a text.
Well, I think sometimes those impulsive movements, if you will, are the best movements. I feel like, especially when we're talking about art and poetry and everything the above. And because we're talking about community so much, can you also share with us, you know, why are these sorts of salons so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what Titus, Clare, and like Marquita were talking about earlier, right? It's like sometimes like coming together by chance or with this intention of like highlighting sort of like the music that people carry, the song that people carry, there's a need for resonance, right? And it sort of gives us a sense of belonging and place. And for me, like, I feel like noticing how people would behave in other poetry readings, like you're always gravitating to the person who has the mic and basically asking, like, wait, how did you get there? How did you get this platform? How do you get folks to listen? But what if, like, you sort of flip the script and sort of, sure, we're centering like a written text, right? But like allowing that text to read us, to highlight what's going on in us, to really be seen by the text. And in that way, in community, be seen by each other. It's inviting folks to realize that like your value in a community isn't when someone important sees you, but it's actually like you can do that seeing. You can pay attention to not just this text, not just this work of art for hopefully longer than 30 seconds, but actually like pay attention to what's being highlighted in a room, like the people who are highlighted to you, not just the people who already are important, if that makes sense. And so when I center, an unknown text, a relatively unknown text prior to its recent publishing in the US, it's a work in translation, Chronicles of a Village, like you're centering something that maybe people would have overlooked in a bookstore. But allowing folks to like read it and see what's highlighted in the text, it trains the eye and the heart, the eyes of the heart, in other words, to like actually look around in your life and being like, what's being highlighted? What's worth being like paying attention to? And in that way, there's these strange connections that start to happen between people. That's like how I live my life in New Haven. It's like, who's being highlighted? And then they become the people that I invite into my home, into a living room, to then pay attention some more.
Well, and we've got about 2 minutes here left, but I actually just had a realization that everyone in this conversation today has come from a different place, and we've all landed in the same place. So I think there's something very magical and kismet with that, the fact that we're having this conversation. And, we've been focused on New Haven and Connecticut, but, because we've all been from different places and we landed in the same place, do you think it's important that every community should have something like this available to them?
So I feel like it's sort of the lifeline of how we remain connected, not just to ourselves, but to the place in which we live, right? Like we need these spaces where we can deeply reflect on what's going on internally in our inner lives. But also we need help, like asking what's worth paying attention to around us. Because otherwise we just will default to the current narrative in America, which is like you live for yourself, you continue to gain status, and your relation to place is basically just to extract its resources, to level up in your career, and then you move again for the next opportunity, right? Like that's just how we relate to place as it's conditioned to us. So we need these spaces of reflection and we need these places of like genuine like community without regard to your status.
Well, that is perfect. A perfect note to end on a show called Where We Live. Michelle, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. You've been listening to Michelle Phuong Ho. Thank you so much for your time today, Michelle.
Thank you so much.
And for our listeners, you can find more of her works on our website at ctpublic.org/where we live. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.